The epicenter of Monday's earthquake was near Gaziantep, Turkey, inside a nation that has been creeping toward illiberal democracy for years. Its president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has led the nation for 2 decades now, but he faces a tough election in just 3 months. Just a few dozen miles away from the epicenter lies the Syrian border. That nation was also devastated in the disaster and has been a pariah state for about a decade. So this terrible disaster, while so deeply personal for so many, is also deeply touched by politics. And we're going to talk about some of that now. Joining me now again, David Miliband and Richard Huss. David, first, tell us your reactions. You run one of the best and largest relief organizations in the world. What's going on? What have you been struck by?
Well, it's a crisis piled on a crisis, a natural disaster piled on a political crisis. Because over the last 3 or 4 years, the world's attention has moved away from Syria, but this forgotten crisis has not been resolved at all. So on a Sunday last week, 15 million people across Syria in humanitarian need, 4 million of them who we helped to serve in the northwest of the country, under the control of a range of rebel opposition groups in desperate circumstances. The earthquake has left people who were already without homes with nothing. And the danger of a secondary disaster, what the World Health Organization call a secondary disaster. The earthquake has killed tens of thousands. The next stage is a health outbreak or an ill health outbreak of desperate freezing conditions and people unable to treat the wounded and unable to survive. And so it's survival that is the issue in the short term, but very quickly the issue will become what's the politics of Syria and how can it come back into some kind of multilateral engagement? Because really, it's been brute force that has left Syria in the state it's in. And the only politics is the Astana process, Russia, Iran, Syria and Turkey. No one else is in the game at the moment. And that's leaving the people of Syria with nowhere to turn.
But in both Syria and Turkey, Richard, what strikes me as, I think, sad but inevitable is that these two leaders, Assad and Erdogan, very different, but are going to milk international support, are going to take the aid they can get, and they're going to use it to strengthen themselves politically. Erdogan is already lashing out at anyone who says anything about the aid. He might be able to ride this to a third term. Assad is going to try to ride this to some degree of legitimacy. And yet you can't do nothing. So what would you do?
That's the dilemma. And we've had it in other countries, such as North Korea. The first thing you've got to try to do is see that the aid you give actually gets to the intended people who need the help. You don't want militaries and others siphoning it off. But it's really hard in Syria because the security conditions that David just described are so bad. So I think this is going to be as difficult as it gets. Turkey's slightly different. It's a more normal, quote unquote, country. The problem there is, yes, Erdogan will try to manipulate this to essentially improve his political prospects. And again, the question is, can we keep control of as much of the aid as we can? I think we have to accept that some of it's going to go to the wrong places. I think you just do the best you can, but you understand it's almost like a tax read. Some of what we send in there is not going to go to the people we're trying to help.
You're on the front lines. What do you think of this dilemma?
Well, the humanitarian aid that's going in to help people with medical kits, with basic cash, with food supplies, the UN World Food Programme is the largest supplier. There's very little leakage from that because we track every ounce that goes in. I think when you're thinking about a wider development, when you're talking about rebuilding roads, when you're talking about rebuilding schools, it's a different game. But remember, for 12 years, President Assad has had the chance to deliver aid into the northwest of Syria, what's called cross-line aid, cross-conflict lines. It's basically zero. The UN reports on this every 6 months. The reason that there is cross-border aid from Turkey into Syria is that there is no aid coming from Damascus into the northwest of Syria. Now, here's the thing. The number of crossing points was reduced from 2 to 1 by the Russian veto at the UN Security Council. The first thing that could be done is open up the closed crossing point, because that will get you into Aleppo, it will get you into the northwest region as well. So there are things that can be done. And I think that it's in the medium term that we're going to have tougher problems. That's where it's when you're funneling through the government that you end up with the kind of issues that Richard is raising.
All right, we talked about illiberal democracy in Turkey. I got to ask you about illiberal democracy in the United States, because you are a renowned foreign policy expert, and yet this book of yours is about domestic politics. Why did you write it?
Because the greatest national security threat facing the United States is increasingly us. Yes, China is a threat, Russia, climate change, pandemics, North Korea, you name it. But if we're not united here at home, if we don't have the bandwidth to focus on these things, how are we going to? So right now, our national security depends on doing something about the gridlock that prevents us from meeting our domestic challenges, and obviously gets in the way of focusing or meeting these international challenges.
When you watch the State of the Union and you see these Republican congressmen heckle the president, does it? I mean, one of the things you talk about is be civil. It doesn't feel like they're reading your book.
Not yet. No, but the president, by the way, had some nice grace notes. I thought when he reached out to the Republican leadership, it was good. Look, civility is important. Today's opponent could be tomorrow's partner. Turns out civility is not just a nice thing. It's actually a very practical thing. Compromise. There is a time in politics for compromise, or we're not going to get things done. The president ruled out political violence. I thought that was an important message. Putting country first. Well, we're going to have a test of that. We'll probably talk about it on your show in a few months when it comes to the debt ceiling. Will we put country first as opposed to party or politics? So it turns out a lot of the things that are going on in the United States reflects the fact that American democracy is in bad shape. January 6th was the most extreme version of it. Maybe Donald Trump, to some extent, was an extreme version of it. But they're reflections. We have a real problem. We don't teach civics in our schools. I think we've got a real deficit there. So we don't have national service on a large scale anymore. So I think there's things that can and should be done. And the lesson I take from this read is we can't be sanguine. We've been around for 2.5 centuries. It's been an amazing experiment based on an amazing set of ideas. Doesn't mean it's necessarily permanent.
All right. Obviously, it is striking a chord because it's on the bestseller list. People should buy it and read it. Thank you both. Next on GPS, the shadowy Russian mercenary group that hopes to help Putin win in Ukraine. We will tell you about the mysterious Wagner Group when we come back. By some estimates, there are 50,000 mercenary troops fighting on Russia's behalf in Ukraine as part of the Wagner Group, a shadowy Russian outfit with international reach and roots that go back to 2014. Founded by Putin's ally Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner Group is believed to get its name from another man behind the organization, a former Russian military officer whose call sign was Wagner in honor of the German composer much beloved by Adolf Hitler. To help us understand the roots of the Wagner Group and the role it is playing in Ukraine today, I want to bring in Sean Walker, Central and Eastern European correspondent for The Guardian, and Fred Pleitgen, CNN's senior international correspondent. Welcome both. Sean, you have this fascinating, lengthy profile of Prigozhin. Explain to us, really, where does it begin?
Yeah, I mean, Prigozhin is a fascinating personality who's very unlike any of the other people in Putin's inner circle. He spent most of his 20s in the 1980s in jail. Then he became a hot dog seller in St. Petersburg. He started setting up restaurants. And at some point when Putin, back in the late 90s, was deputy mayor of Petersburg, he started eating at Prigozhin's restaurant. Seemed to take a liking to this guy. Before long, Prigozhin was catering meetings between Putin and other leaders. And then somehow he gets into this inner circle. And in 2014, when the Kremlin takes the decision, Putin takes the decision to annex Crimea and to start that first invasion of Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, which is very different from the one we saw last year. They are trying to keep it covert. They're denying that there are any Russian troops on the ground, even though, all of us that were reporting there at the time could see there obviously were Russian troops. But clearly in the Kremlin, they started to think, well, what can we do to have a bit more plausible deniability, to be able to intervene and deny that really we're there? And I think that's really the genesis of the Wagner idea. At some point in the spring of 2014, there's a meeting in the Ministry of Defense, and Prigozhin is given this whole set bit of land where he can train fighters. And later on, this group will grow and grow and turn into the Wagner Group.
And Fred, you've been covering it for a long time yourself. They explain the Africa connection. What is the Wagner Group doing in Africa?
Well, the Wagner Group is essentially training African armies. Just a couple of days ago, I actually interviewed 2 Russian convicts who have been drafted into Wagner to fight in Ukraine. And they told me at those training bases, which Sean was just mentioning, that their trainers there were actually Wagner mercenaries who had before that been in the Central African Republic to train those militaries there.
And Sean, when we've been referring to them as mercenaries. And in the Africa case, there really seems to be an outright, it reminds me of some of those the East India Company or something. They're just being given mines or mineral concessions, right?
That's right, yeah. And part of this is Prigozhin's personal ambition, and he has clearly done extremely well out of this. But you obviously can't separate this from the Russian state. And I think, one of the really key things to look at when it comes to Wagner is like a lot of what Putin does, he is doing things that he thinks that the West and specifically the Americans are doing. So where Putin thinks that the Americans are meddling in Russian affairs, so he says, okay, I'm going to meddle in US affairs. Putin thinks that the Americans do up to all kinds of shadowy stuff around the world that they can then deny. Okay, so Russia needs a mechanism to do that. And I think a really revealing answer that Putin gave back in 2018 when he was asked by quite an unusual combative interview, I think, with Austrian television. And eventually Putin says, well, in the US, you have somebody called George Soros. And the US State Department claims that it has nothing to do with Mr. Soros. And in the same way, I claim that I have nothing to do with Mr. Prigozhin. He's just an ordinary restaurant keeper with a sort of wink. So basically what you have is Putin kind of buying into these conspiracy theories that actually George Soros is working for the deep state, is an arm of US foreign policy. And he's saying, okay, well, if that's what I think the Americans are doing, I'm going to do that too.
And Fred, what is the Wagner Group doing in Ukraine? What have you observed?
Well, certainly, if you look at Yevgeny Prigozhin here in Ukraine, I think there's essentially 2 things. They are a very tough fighting force on the ground, especially right now, if you look at the area around Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. But a lot of this is also, it seems very much, about Yevgeny Prigozhin increasing his position, bettering his position, especially, of course, trying to appeal to Vladimir Putin, among the other people who are also trying to do the same, like, for instance, Putin's generals. If you look at the situation around Bakhmut, I spent a lot of time on the ground with Ukrainian fighters who have come face to face with Wagner mercenaries, and they essentially say, look, the reason why Wagner is able to gain ground on the battlefield is because their tactics are so brutal and so in disregard of human life that it's very difficult to defend against them. I met one Ukrainian soldier who told me that his group of about 20 Ukrainian soldiers was up against 200 roundabout Wagner mercenaries. Now, a lot of them are people who are convicts who are immediately recruited out of jail and thrown on the battlefield. And the way that Wagner does this, and I've cross-checked this with captured Wagner fighters who told me exactly the same thing, is that you have these convicts who are in what's called the first couple of waves, which the Ukrainians say is essentially cannon fodder. They try to assault positions head on, each group trying to gain a little more ground while there's massive attrition rates of up to 80% of these guys. And at some point, these Ukrainian fighters are, of course, worn down by having to fight off these waves. And then Wagner does have specialized forces, very capable forces, that then try to attack from the flanks. On top of that, Wagner now has an air force. Yevgeny Prigozhin was just seen inside an aircraft saying he himself was on a mission to bomb Bakhmut. And they also have long-range artillery. And in all these places, Fareed, what we're seeing increasingly, and I think this really shows that Yevgeny Prigozhin is sort of trying to come out of those shadows that Sean was just talking about. So it certainly seems as though a lot of this is about public relations for Yevgeny Prigozhin, but it's also, if you will, a desire to show that this is the only force right now in Ukraine that can get real results for Vladimir Putin, Fareed.
Warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. David, let me start with you today. During his visit to Israel and the occupied West Bank last month, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken discussed the importance of a two-state solution with top Israeli and Palestinian officials. Of course, this is nothing new. We hear this rhetoric from U.S. administrations all the time. Many analysts have said that the Biden administration doesn't really want to engage in this conflict any longer. What would the U.S. have to do in order to actually move the needle on this front?
Well, the U.S. obviously does want to engage with this conflict, and Secretary Blinken's visit was one sign of that, along with the visits in the same week of National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and CIA Director Bill Burns. So I would start by taking strong issue with the idea that the Biden administration has given up on this conflict or for some reason doesn't want to deal with it anymore. The second point, to answer your question more directly, what the U.S. would have to do, I think, is to continue to work with both sides, with all sides, actually, including outside Arab partners, to defuse tensions rather than aggravate them by actions that any side would take, including incendiary rhetoric or attempts to change the status quo in some fundamental way while efforts continue at lower levels to reach conditions that would allow for political progress on this issue.
Khalid, let me get your take on this. The U.S. government continues to reiterate the importance of a two-state solution. From your point of view, is this anything that is in any way realistic at this point? Because there are a lot of people out there that believe that the two-state solution is essentially dead and that there's really no way to revive it. What's your take?
I think the short answer is no. I think going back to the initial question about the administration and its level of seriousness, I think it's pretty clear that this administration does not want to engage in this issue on the Palestinian front. Certainly, it has a very deep relationship with Israel and is engagement with Israel is at extraordinarily high levels. I think the three visits that we saw from senior U.S. officials in the last couple of weeks were pre-planned. They were not in response to the violence on the ground. They were already planned. And I think when the administration talks about a two-state solution, when you have a government in Israel that is literally committed to dismantling a two-state solution from including the Palestinian Authority in some cases. A number of ministers have expressed a desire to dismantle the Palestinian Authority itself. You have Kahanists in the government who are extreme on many levels, but who openly favor annexation in the West Bank. This is the most right-wing government in Israel's history. I think it's sort of bizarre to talk about a two-state solution, not only because you have this extreme government in place that is doing its utmost to destroy a two-state solution, but also because of the violence on the ground. I mean, it's a little bit like standing in front of a burning building and saying, I wholly support fire safety and smoke alarms.
Beth, I saw you nodding along to some of what Khalid was saying. They looked like you wanted to jump in, so go ahead.
I agree with what Khalid is saying. I think that it's simply true that what the Biden administration has been saying about what it wants in terms of a two-state solution simply just doesn't match with what they're doing. And I think that Khalid is right. I think that when you look at the situation on the ground, when you listen to what Palestinians are saying about life under apartheid and occupation, it becomes pretty clear that the likelihood of a two-state solution, especially under this current government, but not only under this current government, looks dead. It's hard to imagine how that could really come forward. And I think specifically the thing that we should also focus on and highlight is the hypocrisy of the Biden administration in that they continue to say that this is what they want, this is all they care about, this is what they're pushing for, a two-state solution. But their actions don't lead us there. It's the status quo right now that they are trying to maintain is a horrible, violent status quo. That's the reality of life for Palestinians living under Israeli apartheid. For Palestinians, even just the last month, over 40 Palestinians have been killed by Israelis. And it's only the beginning of February. And this is coming on the tail end of last year, which was under a different government that was not Israel's most extreme government in history, and in fact was supposed to be a more liberal government, when in fact we know that was not really the case. That created the deadliest year for Palestinians since the early 2000s. And so I think that we have to reckon with reality when we're talking about what's actually possible, could move forward.
Beth, let me just follow up with you on one point. Talking about the Biden administration is one thing, but I want to ask you more specifically about where things stand when it comes to U.S. lawmakers on this issue, particularly Congress. I mean, from your vantage point, do representatives, do senators want the administration to do more to try to resolve this conflict? Is there political willpower on this front?
It's a great question. I think that what we're seeing right now at the beginning of the 118th Congress, which was sworn in right around the time that this new extremist far-right Israeli coalition government came into power, we are seeing that there are cracks, right, in the kind of traditional bipartisan, we stand with Israel no matter what consensus. And you see some senators like Senator Van Hollen, or you see members of the House who are speaking out more and more and starting to say that they are deeply concerned by the actions of the Israeli government. However, what we need to do is move past the point of deep concern. It's really good to see more and more members of Congress who are speaking out and saying that they are worried about what could come down the line from this new government. However, what we really need are for members of Congress to realize that what is already happening right now is already too late. It is already too much. And we need not just statements of deep concern, but action. And actually, Senator Van Hollen, who I mentioned before, is an example of someone who is moving forward on things like pushing for an investigation of the killing of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. Or you have members of the House, like Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, for example, Representative AOC, Ayanna Pressley, Cori Bush, other progressive House members who are increasingly willing to speak out and say that we need actual concrete action, meaning restrictions on U.S. funding, conditions on U.S. funding, cutting. That's what we really need to be pushing for, actions. And while the political will is smaller than it should be, it's growing quickly, and I think will continue to grow the more the current Israeli government is being extreme in its policies.
David, I want to take a step back for a moment and look at some of the other things that are currently going on. Israel's far-right cabinet, they've approved the legalization of 9 illegal settler outposts in the occupied West Bank. There was a statement from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office that said more housing units are likely to be built in separate existing illegal settlements. The Biden administration opposes the authorization of Israeli outposts. They've aired their views against new settlements. I mean, the U.S. provides billions of dollars in military aid to Israel. Does the U.S. government not care? Do they not get offended by the fact that Israel essentially ignores them on this issue?
The question is actually misguided because this is a conflict between two sides, not just one side. And you could ask a similar question about why the administration, quote unquote, ignores the fact that the Palestinian Authority continues to subsidize terrorism against innocent Israeli civilians. You could ask why the Biden administration, quote unquote, ignores the fact that senior members of the Palestinian Authority cabinet and senior members of the Fatah organization, of which Mahmoud Abbas, the PA president, is the chair, why they continue to call for the dismantling, not just of occupation, but of Israel. So the fact is that the Biden administration, like every American government and every reasonable person, is caught between two sides, each one of which has extremists that call for the political suicide of the other side, the Palestinians and the Israelis. And so we need to ask what it is that can be done to get out of this impasse, rather than point fingers only at one side in this conflict.
Khalid, Israel says the military raids across the occupied West Bank are meant to stop attacks against Israelis. Palestinians view this as another example of its violent occupation. Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that his government is going to step up those nightly raids. How concerned are you that this situation is only going to get worse? And what are the implications of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the trend lines are certainly very disturbing. Everything looks like it's getting worse. We've heard or we've seen how the casualty figures, the deaths, especially of Palestinians, but also of Israelis, is much higher this year, and we're only in February than it was last year. So everything is moving. All the trend lines are negative in terms of people's rights on the ground, in terms of basic safety and security, and in terms of any political outlook remotely resembling a two-state solution. On this question of both sides, though, I think we have to bear in mind that there is no parity between the two sides. Israel is an occupying power. Israel is the fifth most powerful military in the world, and it is enforcing its occupation through violence. Occupation is, by definition, violent and coercive. It can only be sustained by force of arms. And so when we see these Israeli raids, that's precisely what these daily army raids are about. They're about enforcing a military occupation over a subjugated population that has been living under martial law for 55 years. And occasionally there are bouts of resistance. Sometimes that resistance is violent, and sometimes it's not. But it's always predictable when you have an occupation that has to use more and more violence in order to sustain itself. So the difference between the Israeli side and the Palestinian side isn't just one of huge power asymmetry. We talked about extremists. The difference is that the extremists are actually in the Israeli government. Mahmoud Abbas's government is quite ineffective, quite weak, but you will be hard-pressed to find a more moderate set of policies and individuals than those who currently reside in Ramallah and rule over the Palestinian Authority. So I think we have to bear in mind these enormous differences. And so this is one of the key reasons that the administration doesn't want to engage, because it understands that engaging, pushing this process along, necessarily means putting pressure on Israel. And that is something, for domestic political reasons mainly, but also for ideological reasons, the Biden administration has zero interest in doing.
Beth, we heard Sarah Khaira's report earlier in the show. Sarah pointed out that this is Israel's most right-wing government. It hasn't been in power for long, but that it's already facing a lot of hurdles, not just about the Palestinian issue. It's also facing accusations of trying to undermine the judiciary, accusations of steering the country away from democracy. What's all this going to mean going forward for the potential attempts at resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and essentially for the government there?
I think what's happening right now is that the mask is fully coming off. Israel has never been a democracy for all of the people that the government rules over. It has always been a country that is upholding apartheid and that is oppressing Palestinians, and that has not been a democracy for all of the people who live under its government rule. This current coalition government has basically sped up the process of exposing that. And it's terrifying and has meant increasing violence and will continue to mean increasing violence. What I think that means, though, what it should mean is that the international community, including in the US, should be responding in kind, right? If the Israeli government is being very clear about the fact that in reality, there is not really democracy here, and any vestiges of pieces of the government that were democratic for Jewish Israeli citizens, for example, are falling apart and coming away under kind of corruption and these attacks on those pieces of the government that were democratic. The US government, for example, should be responding in kind. What you always hear, not just from the Biden administration, but from any past administration really here in the US, has been Israel is a democratic ally. Israel is our most important democratic ally, various versions of that. It has never actually been true. And right now, it is very blatantly not true. And so if this government continues down this path, this is the thing that when Secretary Blinken visited Israel, this was the only thing he really wanted to talk about. He wanted to talk about judiciary reforms, concerns basically that if Israel looked undemocratic, it would make it very difficult for the Biden administration to keep supporting it. It seems pretty clear to anyone paying attention that this government doesn't really care about that. And so if they continue down this path where they are increasingly exposing themselves and increasingly taking off the mask and showing that Israel is just a violent apartheid regime, in fact, and not a democratic ally, then what should be happening is that countries should respond in kind. The Biden administration should respond to Israel as it would to a country that is undemocratic and violently oppressing the people who live under its rule. And that should mean using the pieces of leverage that it has that matter most. For example, the $3.8 billion in military funding that we send to that country every single year.
David, if there is some way to revive talks, whether it's talks about a potential two-state solution or some form of negotiation over trying to stop the bloodshed, how much of a role does the U.S. need to play in mediating this? And are there other international actors who can play a role?
I think other international actors can and are playing a role. The question is, are they playing a constructive role or a destructive role? So people and countries that support Hamas, for example, which is pledged to destroy Israel by violent means and never to agree to peace or a two-state solution, those people are playing a destructive role. People who support negotiations between the two parties, and I find it ironic that someone who claims to represent an organization calling for peace and justice would only accuse one side of a conflict of any problems or violations or issues. People who want to play a constructive role from the outside, whether it's the US government or countries in Europe or Arab countries, would try to get both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, whatever their governments and whatever their failings on both sides, to negotiate with each other and to defuse tensions rather than inflame them. So you do see some Arab governments playing that role in certain aspects of the conflict, so that Egypt, for example, has played a very important role in trying to restrain Hamas from firing missiles and rockets at innocent Israeli civilians on the other side of the border. Jordan has played a constructive role in trying to point out that actually the status quo on the Temple Mount, where Jordan is actively involved, is being maintained by both sides so far, and to warn against any attempts to infringe upon that and inflame tensions. And that's the kind of role that I think I would be looking for, rather than people who hurl accusations at only one side or the other and think that somehow that is going to help resolve the conflict.
Beth, looked to me like you wanted to respond, so I'm going to give you a chance to do so right now.
I think what we just heard is an incredibly oversimplistic idea of what peace actually entails and how we actually get to peace. Peace and justice go hand in hand. And these ideas of how we move forward cannot mean that you are simply erasing power dynamics entirely. That is not actually how things move forward or how we reach a just, sustainable future in which all people are living in equality and injustice. We cannot, Khalid mentioned this early, there are power differentials at play here. You cannot simply say there are two sides, there are many sides, and they all need to come together and talk. We've tried that before, and it led us to where we are now. The truth is there is one government that holds all of the power, and that is the Israeli government, and they are ruling over and oppressing Palestinians. And so I think it's important that we note that the accusations that are being hurled, for example, the idea that Israel is an apartheid government, are things that the overwhelming majority of the international human rights community are saying. This is not just some people here or there, or some countries here or there. There are Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the United Nations. This is something that has been looked into, proven, investigated, not to mention the fact that Israeli human rights organizations are saying it about their own government, and Palestinians who have been living under it for decades are saying it as well. So I just want to note that, in fact, these are quite accepted ideas, except for by countries like the United States, which refuse to acknowledge what the reality on the ground really is.
One issue I wanted to get into a little bit is to ask you, how big a problem right now is the disunity among Palestinian leadership? When you have leadership fractured between the Palestinian Authority in the occupied West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, what does that do when it comes to trying to resolve the situation?
Well, obviously, it's very destructive. The old adage about a house divided against itself cannot stand, I think certainly applies in the case of the Palestinians. They've been deeply divided politically, geographically, institutionally for many years now. It's been since 2007. So that division has been absolutely debilitating and has sapped this Palestinian leadership of any ability to be effective either as a negotiator or as a governing power. And it's also sapped its legitimacy. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing this eruption of violence and this armed insurgency that is concentrated particularly in the northern West Bank, but not exclusively, is precisely because of the ineffective of both leaderships in Ramallah and in Gaza. And so you see Palestinians who are saying Hamas's way of doing things isn't going to work. Abbas's approach of just sitting around waiting for the political and diplomatic stars to align perfectly in Israel and the international community to restart negotiations, that's not going to happen either. And so it's only when the occupation feels that it has to pay a price to maintaining the status quo that it will that things might change. And so that's precisely why we're seeing what is happening now on the ground. And just to go back to Beth's point, we have to look, if you talk about peace, you have to look at the drivers of conflict and not simply put groups of people around a negotiating table and say, talk to each other. Power asymmetry is one of the key factors that drives this conflict, because you've got one power that can impose its will on the ground without negotiation.